Sanje Shinto Mide Wayen Jogun Namda Shimba Chupara Shishu Dhamma Guru Rena Mendal Yataya Mi. Peace to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, learning of the practice of Kiri and so forth. When he became Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. No gentlemen, I go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, by the accumulation of the practices of human to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, by the accumulation of the practices of human and so forth. May I become Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings be endowed with happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from joyful bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from past attachment and anger. May all sentient beings be endowed with happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and cause of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from joyful bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment and anger. May all sentient beings be endowed with happiness and the cause of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and cause of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from joyful bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment.
This ground
Essence flood.
adorned with string flowers, Mount Meru,
The four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine as a Buddha land. I bring it to you. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Thus, the teacher of this teacher is due to the spiritual kindness. I dedicate this treasure for all living beings.
spiritual friends.
Guru Jana Mandala.
Okay.
Where does the fist go? Like, is it opposite of the one you're breathing in?
When you allow that,
Mm,
left hand, you should be touch in the right side.
on the right up,
Then right finger, first close the left
opposite,
nose,
yes, on this.
opposite. Then breathe exit.
Sure.
So,
Mm.
good morning to all.
Morning.
Tene ta tiring jojing azo tembaji court the chiro. Imba inza the tembaji the tembaji motor candice. Tembaji the carde. Ne candice chumba is it Zawarada. As she subject Zorban Tordi Shibayina and Savik and the Chatab Dini Jormuchi Susha Dinala Kasalbodan Kodebush Dinala Sunshando, Taran Digi, Migoa Halam Mindu Samsung. Imbayina Yang and the Digi Yangoroji Chatab Dilla that she in the set of Kundula. The center of Sum Dabachilla doing into Suma. The Juna some sort of. And it's some career is a Vayina. And Tambutala Dembaji and Jay tongue a big then careers. Sangi Thomas Sundula, Dembaji and Ji and Malan Tulas of a Dimas of a Jichi was soon became the careers a teacher. Then Nibatella, the Dembaji, the Jitungu, Jibote, Kongo Girimba, Machi Rimbaza. But indeed, Kongo Girimba, the Kurimze go at the Kurimze the careers teaching. And it's Sumba de la Dembaji, Tajibu Regi, Rangi, Mo careers, Chele careers, Tesore, Moje. And a Jiba de la da Dembajibu Tela, Yewa, Keju, the Dembajibu Rere, like Keju, Chevaina, Ji Nani, and Jiki Midas to do the Yewa Tandanji or the Tajikalo Chazan Tandanga to Ring Chuta Dinala, do you Makumasum, Kaltar Hamati, Tanenga, Tanamindo. Ring Matsabaina, young, Jema Devaji to Junanga to Jema Devaji Juguche, and it on the column, Yangorochi Chadab Dinala, Keju to Chazanji to Zuma, Motanamido, Sonda, Ring Kazubaba, somebody, only somebody as a motor to Sujuguche.
For this session, we have topic on Four Noble Truth, sort of introduction to Four Noble Truth. And His Holiness in this book, he has presented in a very kind of precise and comprehensive and easy to understand, and so it should be kind of, helpful to understand in general the about Four Noble Truth. And here, Geshe, I would like to present in kind of three outlines. The first point, about the reason why there are Four Noble Truths, not more, not less. And the second, the order or sequence of the Four Noble Truths. Why in such order or such sequence, the presentation of Four Noble Truths. And then third, sort of the meaning of, each of the Four Noble Truths and their function or the purposes of why, they are these Four Noble Truths. And additionally, if we have a time, we would go, but probably we won't be able to, further kind of explanations about Four Noble Truths. Generally, each Noble Truth has four features or characteristics. So it becomes total 16. And if time allows, we can go and, talk about that. If not, then we can talk on that in some time in the future. But here, as a kind of, introductory form, we will try to at least cover first 3 points.
Iba Yantak, Kaza Tange, 다다 카툴랑아 드리지 됐었다. 마망암 아리 마용공으로 아리 마용공랑 아주 되니 아리 용다 뚜дл란도 댕이 인데 임바야나래 마마기 아게 시단되는 몽보 아리 마마리 최세단데 예딩인 데서 쇼대긴 데서게 유니도서 고대야를 제바이나 다 아리 돈이 최세 나중으로 제바이나 아니 동알이 제 소아 미디어와 단다 기야다 동알 semla dungal teyagi te tende reaching tani shegi o mares ra tende ji koso ra imani na tere ngazo ge joja de zo de ta tende kor so cha de yode kare zana ngazo demba ji ze de la ji dungal da tegil dojo dewani to de kande se tu gore kande se meba zo gore se degi kolandolen chia da ngazo sheji to te cha de yode imani za digi sheba de ngazo semla dungal ngazo tanda dungal chego yobane dungal sheba de semla soa dungal ji tego yobe kacha de mares ro ngazo de ngodo ji gore tanda dungal zeba de kande chi ngoin sing ji gore aran so tanda dewa tanda dungal zeba de kande ji la ngoin sing go yore ane tambu kerang tola kacha di bayina dewa zeba de kande ji jasare sosongani ro kande ji la dewa zege ngazo dungal zeba de kande ji la dungal zege gore 코니 버럴라 개바다와 가려요레스 어딘지 디베이나
Khechok was saying, it kind of, he had this sudden kind of recollection. When he was in India, there were true monks who goes to, United States in the West, and then there were Geshe who goes for teaching. And when they came back, they always talks about, when you go to West, don't talk about suffering. Don't talk about suffering, and about and on suffering, and do not talk about this. And however, today's topic is very much related with suffering, and its opposite, the kind of happiness, how to free from such suffering. And one something that we try to seek, and another something that we try to sort of stay away from. So this is our topic for this session. And simply by talking about it doesn't necessarily mean that we are suffering, but when we talk about it, what we are trying to do is we're trying to understand about suffering, of suffering, and you can kind of raise this question to yourself when you say happiness and suffering. What does happiness mean to you? What does suffering mean to you? And how can you differentiate between these two? And what do you do about kind of seeking one and trying to stay away from another?
제가 다당 알아들었지 유변적으로 전에 같이 야사줘야 되긴 어다 남이 보도 임바나 차장 지 룰러네 나자게 당근데 개구지 매바지 된디지 예바이나 대 가족이 대화래요. 대화질랑 모든 지고래서 이 결혼전한테 지고 이래. 지고래. 임바이나 대 가족 동업에 니들 뭐마데 저거라 가져다. 부양 림보라 삼로다바나 대 대화 된 가족라 지 로네 로 무트니 다지 조야메바지 대화지 레두예스.
So when we talk about, happiness at this point or in this moment, usually we talk about kind of, having wealth and possessions that we want, and then healthy, your family members, your relatives, people that you like, and probably you would recognize such as a kind of state of, happiness, but is this really kind of something you would consider as a, long-lasting happiness? Would your happiness that you have right now would stay for, something for a long time, or something that kind of is unending?
임바송자다 방법가라도 당하도 시름 붙이게 다자교 돈받고 찾아봐이나 동봉 알아서다 집까지 그냥 인데 gen지 임발라 어다 지 야베세서 총 안에 야세 로니 서고 버도 도서 경 대jesu 다지 로도카와체네 상예니 니마 집지고 든다도 자든다 든지 jesu 다 코로나 대상볼라 토마 젠지 총거도 저 거데 바치 자위요래 대 자위요가 sonza 다 딘데기 고네 다 예단이 첨벽에 넘버 2 상기 좀 된데라 되자 안 돼 용도라 단다 나 디지털에서 다등이 결라 꾸르메
Tema ga sungshin de.
교지 진행 가자바 덴데니를 삼된 주스 로 덴데니를 삼된 교지 진행 가자바 덴데니를 삼된 주 대한 양은 대체디 진줄미데 결라메스 아니 상기 좀 된데게 안에 덴데 잠무 숨발레 데네 아니 덤바 양다바 덤바 팀이 기부 임바도스마 두고요로 돈다 조 가리즈 거래잖아 상기기 상기 좀 된데게 최 손바 대나니 추기 부부 예리 지동자지 손바래 대 탐지기 나네 내가 안 봐도 송고백이 최 송고백 юм생 가르레스 상기 좀 된데 라니 레이바나 땐도 대와 톱사래 타바 상기지 고바를 묻자데 톱사래 어다 그도 있나지 대응하는 도마 주도야기 상황담아서는 수저 니바데 차장지 톱 사바래데 이나야 최송고 겸장 가래서는 거의 나라네 되게 sem전돼서 동al 아마 상계 좀 된데 라니지 동al 대단데 연구 여번 나이진 거의 나네베 sem전되다 탐제 동al 대리 교배하기 제도 합연하면 초도 교바데 가래샤즈 지두가라 다 덴바지 거의 나네 되게 미드 담보 동al 대어데 가래 모시고도 아주 모싱입니다 다나 동al 잡아도 모시고도 동al 모셔가나 된 중사 가와니 주고도 된 모시고도 다 모셔가나 텔라지 매바줘야게 탑람두가 민도 좋아 동al 때다 매바줘야 탑람 때데 당 고바제네 때 하고도 당 고바자데 하고나 때 매바 간디스도도 거기 고바젠 토비야데 간디스도 톱고도 이게 유다 텔라 람즈네 무슨마 송이들라 사이게 쭉 가서 송바데 난기다 닝보나니 지 맞고 미담마서는 저기 날라다 림보치 다른 다면다 자고를 다 신단자 야가 자고를 때도 관계나니 조다고 때다 소소라 자치쇼 신당 치쇼 가리 임바데 시부지다 저 임바이난 저기 날라양 지 냐다 현다 민다와지는 냐르고로 어때나 진짜네 두스마 덴바 지다 덴데다 보시 차대요 그래서
So therefore, when we look at the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, he started his life just like like us ordinary human being, and he was born as a prince, and then he took kingdom, being a prince state for 20 up to 29 of age, and then after that he gave up his princely life, and he went into extreme kind of practice of meditation for 6 years, and later considered as attaining of enlightenment. And after attaining of enlightenment for 7 weeks he didn't said anything, and then after sort of silence, the first teaching that he gave was of this Four Noble Truth, and so Lama Tsongkhapa, the great Lama Tsongkhapa, said that in referring to Buddha Shakyamuni, that whatever teaching that you taught, everything sort of derives from concept of dependent origination. And in this, one verse, Lama Tsongkhapa was establishing, Buddha as a valid, teacher through the reasoning of dependent origination. or interdependency. And Buddha himself, as you know, Buddha taught usually what we call 84,000 heaps of teachings. And the reason why Buddha gave such kind of extensive teachings, from Buddha's own point of view, there's really no need. He himself was enlightened and has attained the ultimate happiness and attained sort of complete freedom, liberation. There's really no need for him to be kind of, further sort of moving into this spiritual journey. But however, he knows that when he was in psychic existence, the ordinary people kind of, they are sort of suffering their existence. And therefore, the best method, the best way to kind of help, sentient beings in cyclic existence is through kind of showing sort of, through this teaching, Four Noble Truth, beginning with, helping them to identify what is their suffering and where does those suffering comes from, the origin of suffering, and how can they attain the state of complete cessation, the true cessation. And to attain such cessation, what are the ways and method and path? So therefore, this teaching of Four Noble Truth is considered as the, sort of various, we can say, kind of, core essence, like if you have a big treasure house and something that you consider as the most precious one to yourself, it's that teaching, hardcore and most precious teachings of, all Buddha's teaching. So therefore, this Four Noble Truth.
Indigi Gumtenla Tene, ta Chi Demba Ji, they are this Sangi Chubun Chusun Shabate Nangi and Nenga Soji Ingo de Kares and Jerimbuchi Lamrin Chimana Tanda. Riva. Ne Karingo. The Majini Tabachi Junkundu, Lentomar Sunshins, Katandi.
Oh, on your losses.
Lentomar Sunshins. I don't like it. The Majini Tabachi Junkundu, Lentomar Sunshin. Oran Jubatan, Tere, Dobenenam, the worship you by him base. Imba, Namdo Dubala, Shindo Kalchis in Yamlin and Gadom Chivis, Rimba Tentar to Lomachigo Sos. Jerumuchi Tesumbares.
Yes.
Take it, Ningdon over the Arijugo Zavina, and then Dembajipote, and then Sanji Jondan de Sunduala, taking into Gaso, Yana Yandu Sumbare, Temin into Gaso, Yana Yandu Sumbares, Karezavana, Dembajipote, Sanji Jondan de Toma, Chugan and Toma de Dembajipuchade. The Dembajipote, Yana Yandu Len Sumda, Namdan Chunis in it, Chi Chiagiore. But the Neguni, that Tenzin Temek into Kanganado, Kangi of the Somainza, Dembajibo, Tenzin Nabasangi Junala, the Tebasumbian, Tebasungala, Tumocha there, yes, no Tumoa. Right. That lens on the Nana Domazitola, Karizgo Rizavania, and the Penasangi Tumdan, the Toma get Porangatis and Polasun Dola. Dini Tungal Pape Dembao, Dini Kunju Pape Dembao, Dini Gopa Pape Dembao, Dini Lam Pape Dembao, or the chick to Mason. Right? Then that Tichibu, that go to go Marin to Jig Lola Pape, the Sungo de Carazana, Ombu Raming, Chingazo go to me to Nazo Giro. Tindi Rimbaletini. Dungal Galonda, Dungal Shebarja, Kunju Pabarja, Gobangonducha, Lam Gombarja into Shason. That take it to younger Tungal Shaper Chede, Shaper Charme, Punju Power Chade, Power Charme, Gobangundu Chade, Gombar Charme, Lam Gombar Chede, Gombar Charme, do such in it. That Rimbigi, that Shadagi, Sundangi, Rimbada Matuna, Rimba Mida, Ambu, Zembaji in days and motors of the Pichi. That they Judela, the Londa Dungal, Shaper Jazz, Dungal, the Shegores, Hakugore, Reza Chiche. Then they should the Lata Dungal shape as any Digumares, not Karche Gores, Zedola. Dungal shape as any Dugamarita, Shemaina, Dungal the Meba, they are top carry or a tail. Lambe who your is Sungori, Tundan Dondotira, 동알 집은 네 동알에서는 못 잡아진 가서 못 잡아진 잠진 가서 라기기 동알 녀모부터 매버서 두고 말해. 때 인반상 동알 하고 왔든지 되게 말해. 동알 매버서 탑라 배고 그래서 다 동알 쉐버체 쉐버 잘 매서 등라. 뒤주고라. 다 덴데기 림베고네 다 타바좀 두모와 송바래. 덴데 송바데 양는 양도 송바데 에 코아나네 되게 샘진데도 아니 코알란 주도 간디스 제거레스. 코알란 단다 동알 마셰 바다 대 유마파베 에 윤단다 델라테네 코알라 주데요 양는 양도 코알라 코르데요. 코아텔레 도바라 상이 좀 되는 내진지 차발라 가르치고 그러잖아. 그 유다한테 방거래. 코아 유드 방나 코아방 도그래. 대방 투바이나 에네 상기전에 자기래. 대 차발라 대 방야기 탑 가르래. 탑 람덴데래. 람덴델라더니 상기게네 고된 자데. 상기 고방세 고방 고된 자데. 두수 톱기래서네. 렘바테다 방탄판로 때로 주도기 림바테다 아니 쉐고레스. 대 쉐바데 아니 베 칼로 덴바지부 되게 뒤되요레스. 대 뒤바 인자 오다 타르바던도 얘기지. 오다 마란조 동알 민데바 나지 동알 민데바 던도 얘기지. 동알 매버줘야라 던도 얘기지. 오다 대완도 발라 대완 던도 얘기지 간사지 임바이나 되게 내단데 다 지마지진 셰네 두스마 람지린 발란 주고레스.
Yes.
단다 되게 돈다 다 된디도 도르디도 도시나.
Yes. So therefore, as said earlier, Four Noble Truths teaching is the sort of core, the essence of the Buddha's entire teaching. And related to that, Lama Tsongkhapa in his, great treatises on the stages of Path Lamrim Chenpo, Shema Tsongkhapa has said, just like, last time I did, I will post this quote on the Facebook community. So later you can look into those. This is a quote from Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatises on the stages of Path Lamrim Chenpo. This being the case, the four truths are taught repeatedly throughout the Mahayana and Hinayana, since the Sugata or Buddha has included in the four truths the vital points concerning the process of cyclic existence and its cessation. This teaching is crucial for achieving freedom. Since this synoptic outline of practice is important, it must be taught to students in just this order. So, so the meaning, what Tsongkhapa is saying here, Four Noble Truths, the essence, the core of Buddha's teaching, as said here, is something that is common across all Buddha's, sort of followers or vehicles, both greater vehicle as well as Theravada systems, lesser vehicle. And Buddha taught repeatedly this. So the point is that we find Four Noble Truth teachings in sutras of all vehicles repeatedly over and over. And so this is something that is common across, all Buddha's, we can say, vehicles or school of followers. And when talking about Four Noble Truth, generally there's a talk, there is the ways of sort of saying that Buddha taught Four Noble Truths 3 times in 16 kind of enumerations, And as said earlier, this teaching, the first teaching, Four Noble Truths, was taught to, first 5 disciples of the Buddha, 5 disciples. And simply saying that this is kind of, truth of suffering, sort of directly introducing them is not sufficient for ordinary people to understand. So therefore, this kind of, we see 3 kind of sort of repetition. In the first repetition, Buddha just kind of sort of directly introduced, each one of them, saying that this is the noble truth of suffering. This is the noble truth of origin of suffering, and this is the noble truth of cessation, and this is the noble truth of path. It's introduced sort of enumeration, these 4. And then second kind of reputation, Buddha mentioned that, monks and scholars, monks, the truth of suffering must be realized or understood. And truth of origin of suffering must be eliminated. And truth of cessation must be actualized. And truth of path should be implemented or practiced. So simply kind of knowing, truth of suffering does not really benefit, the intellectual knowledge. Knowing doesn't make our freedom goes away. I mean, suffering goes away. So therefore, we need to kind of, understand the cause of suffering and, sort of goes into it and eliminate it, the very suffering that we don't want to kind of be with. And then in the third repetition, Buddha again said that, truth of suffering must be understood, but it cannot be understood. Truth of suffering origin of suffering must be eliminated, but cannot be eliminated. So kind of, he went into a whole kind of another level of the understanding of the four nature of the Four Noble Truth. And we are here kind of, explaining this briefly what Tsongkhapa's quote here. Concerning the process of cyclic existence and its cessation, process of cyclic existence and its cessation, basically it talks about, how one enters into cyclic existence and how one can free from cyclic existence. So there's a, engaging and sort of reverse process. So Four Noble Truth talks about that, how sentient beings, basically another way of saying is falling into cyclic existence and how one can free from cyclic existence. And just like Buddha himself, if one wants to kind of seize the suffering of cyclic existence and free from it, one must start from understanding the nature of suffering, and then knowing the origin of suffering, and stopping that kind of suffering, attaining cessation through the practice of path. So it talks about kind of how one falls into cyclic existence on the one hand, and on the other hand, how one can free from cyclic existence again through these Four Noble Truth. And so therefore here kind of he's saying that Tsongkhapa, that it's the outline of this practice is important, especially if one is seeking, liberation, how one can seek such liberation by following, these orders presented here. Also, how if one is yearning to kind of stop being kind of, being with suffering, how can one free from, sort of eliminate suffering? Again, one must follow this kind of process or outline here.
주봉 예리 좀 지동 도스마 뒤바이나 군년 조단 군이 녀모 저기 초 직당 남장 저기 초 니진 도스마 예와 체르와 에네 다 군이 녀모 저기 초들라 에네 다 동알 덴바당 군주 덴바니 데 군이 녀모 저기 초라체 에네 고베 덴바다 람지 덴바니 니데 남장 초라 체 거드나 에네 군년 저 최순바 강인바데 군년 조단 남장 초 니수데 군인 조부들라 다 동알담바당 대주 공주담만이제 네 남자 조들라 고베담바다 람지담 니스 제네 담바지 송고베 좀전 텔라테네 덤베게 담바지도 송바데스.
The reason why Buddha taught just kind of Four Noble Truth, these four truth, we can say that entire Buddhist teaching, which is 84,000, heaps of teachings, can be categorized into two kind of, two section or two group. The first one is what we call, absolute afflictive side, absolute affliction or delusion. And then another one is, absolute kind of, liberation, or well-trained. So under absolute affliction comes, the true suffering and true origin of suffering, and under the absolute kind of, train or liberation comes true cessation and true path. So for that purpose, we can say four truths were presented.
Tate tege ta zambaji songobe yumzenda zambaji tangebe ane jima do ngazan tula soba misumba jina tangebe yumzende tiba chero tini chige. Tene ta nipa desa temba ji kurimze tere roa. Ta ona temba ji tangebe na temba ji sungdu gala ane kurim kandese sumba res. Ta kurim dela chida sangi ki chue sumba kari sumba yinba ko kurim rimbaji sundange rimbaji yorwa. Tela chida yunde ton rimzene duzuma chi yungo re. Ane yuljen gondo yula ki rimzene ni yungo res. Rwa. Te ni yobe nani tanda di kare zena tambu dungal pabe demba ozi chik sung. Ta gelong ta dungal shebar jahaz ne sumba re. Ane kunjung pangbar jahaz nipa tela. O yunde ni kunjung chodela yu kunjung demba tan dibu dungal demba ni re. Ngoni chana yu kunjung demba tan ngon la ki ne te chesu dibu dungal demba te chesu ki waro. Kun dibu chadero. Kunjung demba dibu chadero. Kun chesu yongo sotebsi yorwa. Yore te tanda sangi ki dujala ten yung dungala te masen bachine tambu dibu dungal demba te dusu masen. Te chesu ta dungal demba te kauni jungare te dungala ta yu te kunjung demba tele jungare dusu ma temba res.
Yes.
Te digi terim tela ta kare zane ten goa de kare gyumchan kare zaba ina yulchen gondo yula kirim zogorwa. Kare zana tambu di pena jindun chambang gombege anda di kasangi kyola lungji tangi samsa.
No, long terms the
Di
initiation of the
o yulama le nala.
Ulama.
Yulama rawa.
Oh.
Yulama nala neni sheja negi yuni panja las. Then neni sheja negi yuni panja la then topja meni tembar chabaltaras. Dungal yudan tengo panda tejin lams. Sheja panja ripar chaji tembar chaaz sumbari rawa. Te kare zananga tambu pego ne ngato sheba ina. Ane michila nezu ne sab chimbuji yoba ina. Tambu ne de ngo kare sha te hako res. Menju chebala menju ne kurangi ngo ma sheba ngo ma teba chine memba kaza menza kaza kebaji yimba ina te ne de la menju che tu mares.
Yes.
Te ko ne de la menju yang tabaji che gu yo na ko ne de ngo kare sha te ne kurangi ngo de ngun jing gu res jing yo res. Ne de ngo jin sare ngo jin sare jesu ane ta ko ne de ju yu gen kan do ro. Yu karela teni jungsha, yen karela teni jungsha, teni negi yugen de tse chigures. Negi yugen tse chene, ta te yugen te ta mebar zoyala, membi ki men tengores, men de tegore. Men de teni ta chi nepa ki membi temba teba nechi, men de nyamso lamba yin, ta zeba yina, ne tele tarwa chi yung tuko rwa. Te ne jingi ta, ne ni sheja, ne ki yune panjala zidi, ne le peja ne sumpa res.
Yes.
O, amu tele nde chigir rwa.
Yes. So with that, we went kind of briefly over the reason why Four Noble Truth and not more or not less. And now next we'll go to the order or sequence why Four Noble Truth is presented in such kind of order, beginning with true suffering and origin of suffering, cessation and path. Whatever Buddha taught, whatever he gave teaching, there's always, order and sequence, and there's a reason why he did that specifically. Usually we kind of broadly categorize into two in terms of cause and effect. One order is cause and effect. And the second order is in terms of how, subjective mind attain realizations. We can say, the attainment of the realizations, how one attains realizations in one's mind. That's another order. And if you look kind of straightforward to Four Noble Truth, what we see is first, kind of Buddha saying suffering, which is the result of the origin of suffering. And Buddha taught first kind of result and then cause. And, so it would kind of be appropriate to say Buddha, for Buddha to taught first cause and then result. But Buddha didn't did in that order here. He first start with the result or consequences, and then second he talks about presents the cause of such a result, to first suffering and then origin of suffering, and so we can say that therefore this Buddha's presentation is the order is based on how that the second category, how realizations is attained in one's mind in terms of that order Buddha taught, this in this order. And so for this, we use a quote by Buddha Maitreya in his text Sublime Continuum. And Maitreya Buddha, kind of presented this order using a metaphor, saying illness must be understood, its cause is eliminated, well-being must be attained, and medicine taken. Likewise, suffering, its causes, their cessation, and the path must in turn be understood, eliminated, realized, and relied upon. So, just an example of a person who is badly kind of, with illness or sick. The first process would be identifying the illness. What is the illness? Without knowing the illness, even if there is the best doctor, he couldn't be able to, help with the treatment. So the first one is understanding the nature of the illness or identifying the illness itself. Once the illness or the disease is identified, the second is finding really what are the causes of such illness or, the disease. And with that kind of preceded, then, prescription of medicine. And when that medicine is taken then by that patient, there will be sort of, treatment or freedom from such illness. And this is the metaphor or example that was especially, in terms of the order, how Buddha gave Four Noble Truth, and this metaphor kind of example of patient and treatment.
yang PGG pejanang azo tanda changra tunin naza dogin dili kana jin thama tin naza zugo orwa ta naza zugo orde changra tin naza zonye kaza jila chajana members atanga didi kerang da ani changra tunin naza de zo shahala tambu naza de ngode ji orwa te naza de ngode ji zo ta kerang 다니 조디 차라 땡기요 말했어. 차라 템바데게 나다주고 유지고 바데 때고 치수된 쉐그로라. 너무 결항은 나자데 디리샤. 차라게 되셔긴 나자르자. 타마테네 저게지는 타마테네 나자데 저겨리샤. 다 나자데 매버주고요나. 나자데 미용 지고요나. 타마 마테네 되고 야마나 차라테네 저긴 통리 저긴 짐바이나. 차라 마통 맞잖아. 그 맨 가자면서 가자잖아. 나자 양결 그 랑게 되기로 와. 때는 jin기다 지 타마기 나자 중에 미들라 그 나지긴 중시 타마 탱유데 참 맞아봐도 그 나자데 매버서 두고 말이 타마 삼자베나 그 나자데 매버서 두고 그랬어. 어때는 jin기 다 지부 동알 덴바데 중에 매버지도 발라 이 군중 덴바 kunju demba delaya leji kunju na nyomo kunju ni yebe nani oda leji kunju mebar zogo wa de ya leji ni ginane leji kunju na nyomo kunju ni ginane nyomo kunju zo ja go des nyomo kunju zo ta nyomo kunju delaya arezana docha jana de nyomo kunju de ye gi yu karezana docha jana de mo sumdeni zawategi chigo des nyomo tamje kiagi 소데 도자제당 두모스 대송기 나네 자와 강레서 바이나타 마리바 봐 추라도 넘버 제발라니 디버 체킹이 딥제 지게 딥제 마리바 덴지 마리바 테레 덴데게 덴지 마리바데 메버 조거레 제 상기게 손베 림바데레스 당 유정문도 유라 기림지도나
Yes. if you use another example, somebody say who is alcoholic or having an illness from smoking, and if he goes to a doctor, a physician would in the process would first he would say that your illness is caused by this problem of smoking or either alcoholism, and then the next he would say, if you want to treat your problem, you should stop smoking or alcohol. Without stopping these two, it doesn't matter how much medicine that you take, treatment that you take, it won't help. So pointing to the cause of the very specific problem. And so the point here is that if you don't stop the origin, you won't be able to stop the result. And likewise, coming back to the meaning, to suffering of the truth is the result. And if you want to eliminate suffering of truth within yourself, you need to eliminate the origin of suffering. Without eliminating the origin of suffering, you cannot, free from suffering that you don't want to sort of experience. And so, therefore, pointing to the origin of suffering. And when we talk about the origin of suffering is, sort of composed of two sort of things, right? The first one is karmic action, and the second is afflictions or delusions. So these two components. And within these two, the primary one is the second one, affliction. And again, when we look into the affliction, the root of the affliction is attachment, hatred, and ignorance, these two. Again, these three is, sort of arises from what we call not knowing. Not knowing could be translated as ignorance as well. Not knowing in a sense that your wisdom capable of discriminating what is good and bad completely kind of obscured, and ultimately kind of it points to what we call truth grasping ignorance. So this is the kind of the ultimate kind of cause of the suffering, and one needs to eliminate such kind of self-grasping ignorant mind. And so here what we are talking about is how within a subjective mind one can attain the realizations of the path or antidotes of such kind of suffering in terms of that.
Tendegi gimtala teneta jibu dungal temba tengondu te yu kunjung temba che oda namjang choki chodela ta topja gobi temba senji oda dungal tele mebar zoena kari thogire dewa kari thogire janta goba ze arba ze jiwa ze nyangde ze o savegi tanda chigres so 제가 덴디지 도구어래서 다 지와서한테다 동알 델레 타라이나 다 덴도 되와 남양 동알 균이 녀에메 바 덴디지 타예요 그래서 디부 덴디지 람미바이나 아 데미 톱제기 람델랑 좀 배고를 다 간디스 톱그레서 배기로 다 톱제기 람델라 다 람지 된 바즈네 다 남장 초기 되발랑 고베 된 바다 람지 된 니지 다 빼는 자자는 가지고 단다 네 유는 보고 중중 같더니라 보고 중중 같더니 보고 들었다 제 로정 야부지 여바이나 좀 로정이 좀더 야부지 담바이나 콜라 이 마오반에 내가 야부라 그래 자가 야부지 냠바 야부지 라게르잖아 텔라 미닝 다 원줄라고 유란 대용에 탑란 배야지로 로정을 쇼자야 어다 잘 장년 전반나 잘 기계다 좀 드리지 자기 민정부 자기로 다 자가 좀 보지 드리지 요래서 자가 될 미는 가지고 잘 장하라 공부해야지요. 어딘데도 보지 차대요 그래서.
So that is the the order of true suffering and origin of suffering. This next set, cause and effect, true cessation and true path. And when we say true cessation, the synonyms: cessation, liberation, pacification, nirvana, or liberation, all meaning the same thing, basically. It refers to the state where there is a complete cessation of suffering. The suffering never has to experience again. And, the ultimate kind of state of peacefulness or cessation of suffering. To attain such, cessation, one must engage in, path, true path. And the example here would be, when we give education to young students, we use approach such as, if you study this, then in the future, you will become this and that. We are basically kind of sort of, using the future yet to attainable result as a something, sort of encouragement for that student. Likewise, in the athletics, if you won, you will get this reward. So we're using consequences as something to lure, practitioners into, practice or implementing.
송자 다 덴바지 덴고베 김선저 와라 림바카레잖아 율정원도 율라 기름전에 대자고 다 단다디가서 덴바지 송고하대 야 중카지 나라 중카세 나라 베나 신 장방금베게 단다 된송다 원도 옛날에 되니 지어네 가리고 유당 람다 동안 고발라니 그림진데 대급수 덴바지 송고를 좋아 지금 잠깐만 것도 옛날에 덴바지 송고를 때 송도가라 유당 람다 동안 고발라니 그림진데도라 당부 군주 덴바다 람지 덴바 니송 대지수 안에 동알 덴바다 고베 덴바 니도 수마 송바래 유당 람다 동안 고발라니 그림진데도라 다 대가래잖아 윤리 등기를 봐서 자위기 남장 쪽이 더블라 남장 쪽 윤리니 군년 쪽 윤리니 돌아 군년 쪽이 윤리니보다 유원라 손은 디보다 좀 두고 어려워 자위기 드림 찾아봐이나 다는 이제 남장 쪽라 임바이나 남장 쪽이 유람지 된 바라 먼저 제바나 디보 고베 된 바된 톱도 어려워 덴데기 윤리 등림라 되네 단다 온도기는 숨바데 때레스 윤리 등기를 봐야 돼.
So therefore, why Four Noble Truth and why in this order sequence? This sequence is based on how one attains realizations or path within oneself, based on that order. However, there is a order based on cause and effect, which was presented in Maitreya Buddha in his text ornament realizations. In that text, Maitreya Buddha kind of follows cause and effect sequence, first beginning with the cause and then result. In that order would be first true origin of suffering, then second suffering, and the other set first would be true path, and then second true cessation.
선바자 되게 디제 다디랑 저도 트네 하나 사기 점된 되게 손들어라 니니 동알 덴바 오즈네 마수 받지는 니니 동알 파페 덴바 오즈 손바레스 좋아 니니 동알 파페 덴바 오 니니 군중 파페 덴바 손바레 동알 덴바스 저거 말이스 파페 덴바스 저거 김장 가르레스 좋아
Yes.
파페 덴바스 저거 김장 가르잖아 단당 아랑 졸란 지 동할 때 동할님 막뭐 저기어요 라 저기어요 뭐 신기어요 하잖아 신기어 말이스
Yes.
가르치네 당연히 공도 디바네신 계랑 쪽에 계랑 돌라 동할자한테 간디질을 제거래 대화자한테 간디질을 제거래 다들라 렌지 잡다.
Yes. So the another thing related to this here is when Buddha taught Four Noble Truth, the actual wording would be, this is the noble truth of suffering. He just didn't say that this is a true suffering. He used the word noble truth of suffering, noble truth of origin of suffering, noble path, and noble cessation. And why? What's the reason for emphasizing the word noble here? And at this point, for ourselves, we don't sort of basically identify suffering as a suffering. We don't know suffering as a suffering, and we don't know, why suffering and why happiness. So that's the reason why Geshe raised earlier in that question: what do you mean, suffering to you? What does happiness mean to you? And kind of consult about it.
Oh.
Mm.
And Tanang Aranzola, Tangi, Zavanajide, Otachi, Lojoga Chane, Ditaje, Otak, Chimzangi Chane, Ta, Amapudu, Sama Lenzom, Samala Lulan, Chi, Ne, Nazala, Tindi Cake, which Mevaji, Eta, Tindiji Yavana, Ting Azuki, Ta, Mazu Mitila, Cindy Chibola, some Tambaina, Cindy Chibola, and Chi, Nam Mashibodo, and a pay, Tendu the Agi, the Wachi Reves. Some do is also the water. The rich long also the one wins go.
So as raised earlier, how do we identify happiness, in our life? Would that be sufficient, as we said earlier, having sufficient wealth and possessions, having family members, relatives all healthy, together? Is that something that you consider happiness, in this life? Something, kind of ultimate or forever happiness? Would you consider this as a happiness?
Oh.
Yeah, he's saying he is asking question to you.
This could last forever. It's kind of happiness. Family all together could last forever.
But what about the suffering of change?
That's why I said if it wouldn't change.
Possible groups.
Everyone.
Just to know this, if we haven't, all us out later, all us out there.
그래서 뭐 란딜러도 계시 동해성원은 교래 동해로 계시 교래 동해 매워지 아니 배도
This is young Christ.
텐자도 지나인데 다들 대왕은
They also Jane or Chazan, they also Jane Young Tanda. Mazukita Penanganazola, but hello, that Chig surprise of your chick. Chawachu Chambuchi, top job of Jajla Chagachi, Punjabu Tendiji Rabena, Mazu Sanglachi, Je Mishibi, Tagachi, Swazin, Chiungur. Then they get saw the Tangazuki. Then but they saw the one, saw the watch it in the red one. Saw the watch it red it. Tanda, they want my mother reveted. Reve Sevana, they Karzorda, Kapto Kaptojin, Negapchir in the Wazor. Tanda, they want Dungalte Dungali Bang, Motus, more meter, shingi me to the Imsan Karis two or then. Tendegi, they watching Atol in Yoman, they want my mother Chagi me to the Gores. Mazuki, they were in one jingo, and I don't tell Shibuji, the Waris over. But then Tandang Aranzo Lachi, Lila, Nasa Meva, you Penjor, Chimdana, the Kangi Chanichi, Yabuchi, Lamdo de and Tati Shibuji, they win, keep in the Mize wins Zigore. Zigore, Tindegi, Devati, Lochi Ni, Magna Yamana, Tiring Deva in a Sani, Tele and a Pel Doti, Tele Chair, Lungaji, Mori, Gur Miseva, Rio Mare, Tapa the Tempayo, Yomari. Karazana, Tengi there was a Tatuki there was in the Tevaji, Chagu Maris. Then they Chagu Mebasanta, Nazuki, Tanang Aranzola, Yon Diagi, Devati, the Wayim Moons into Amare. They Moons into Gun, the Sure is the Vainata, Papi Demba Zedion, Yon, take two singles. The Majibutala Papi Demba Zergo Gimse. Tanang Aranzola, Yonagi, Devati, they are Tengi, they were the Rio Mat, they were Nazu, they want Zingo, Tengi, they were member. Pabegi, Palam Jaji Toy, Matu Lamla Jan in Dovaina, Chi Tolam, Solam, Jolam, Tolam, Homlam, Milolams and Lamga Yungores, Sangia de la Sangia Pap de la Lam Rimbanga, Rimbang and Rimba Sumba, Solam, Jolam Mila, Tobu, Tendiki, Mons in Togo Mari, Tolam Zendicata, Tolam Zend the Tobaina, de la Papazigores, Casa de la, Tolam Top de Casa de la Papazigore. 딘디기 통람 톱드냐 가사 더부지기 당당 알아줘라 지 녀하게 대화대 대화인 방은 대화 많이 방어 저거래 뭔진 두고래 대화 많이 봐 하고 그래 딘디기 파바지기 다 동알인 방어 저건 군주대 방어 저도 그래 어다 띵뭐 저도 가르잖아 그 람라 담보 동알도 가르잖아 아주 장부터 동알 덴바타 부지나 동알 덴바 모트 바텔라더니 동알 덴바 곰 바텔라더니 곰 비뇨아텔라 다오 유라 동알인 바 하고에 로직 또바지 두스마 시랍지 기고레 상ар 메베 인디기 로직 기고레 되게 로데게다 te 동알인 바 모트 두고레스 인상 파발라더니 요다 파베 덴바제 자고 김된 데레가 소소기올라 조람바 톱데요 바이나 모터 두고 하면 다가는 이 졸람바 톱데 지 졸람 톱데요 바이나 동알인 바 모터 두고 말해서 임바 인상 밥에 된 바자고 김전 때에서 다는 티야
So you were saying when you answer, so forever and changing, you're saying this is what he's going to talk about. So you're saying this is coming, and when we have, he was saying when we have, something kind of something good happen, immediately when there's a surprise, something, we consider that as a happiness, a great joy, surprising thing. And this does give, a sense of joy, pleasure, but they are by nature very temporary, and so therefore, we are saying earlier that, we, when we say we, ordinary people, cannot identify suffering as a suffering, happiness as a happiness as a happiness. And what we consider and identify sort of happiness for us is, as we said earlier, with sufficient wealth, possessions, happy, healthy, successful life, family members. And that is something that we consider as a happiness. But again, these are something very temporary, at most several years. In shortest moment, tomorrow could be completely different, could change and into more kind of suffering. And so there's really no kind of what we call ultimate or genuine happiness in what we consider as a happiness. And so therefore, the one who is capable of identifying suffering as a suffering and happiness as a happiness is noble beings. And therefore, these are called noble truth. And noble beings, when we say noble beings, if in Buddhist path, we have a 5-part beginning with path of, accumulation and then preparation and part of seeing. And somebody who has attained part of seeing are called Aryas or noble beings. So ones who attain a part of seeing then has, this kind of going through knowing suffering, experiencing, the suffering and its cessation, has an actual experience of what true or genuine suffering is, and therefore happiness is. So, part of accumulation, preparation, seeing, and then meditation, no more learning. And ordinary people who have attained, first two part of preparation and part of accumulation, also won't have a capacity to really understand, true suffering as a suffering. It only happens at the level when one attains a part of seeing. And so therefore, Aryas or noble beings at the part of seeing, they understood, suffering as a suffering, origin of suffering as origin of suffering through their own experiences. And that experiences and knowledge comes from kind of, following the path and stages and sort of cultivating and attaining what we call realizations or wisdom, which really kind of is able to, this kind of, we can say consciousness, realizations, wisdom, intelligence, that wisdom makes them to kind of, understand or identify suffering as a suffering, and therefore, become a Arya or noble being. And so that's the reason why, these four truths are called noble truth, not truth of like us ordinary people.
Okay. Tea break.
Right?
Okay. Now we have to fight more than suffering, but strongly. 인바인사 다 대신 ngōze de share de nanga tu la de ba de ba
Yes.
rimba sumba de jing ngo tamba jing ngōze ta ngōze na ko kariji la jago re zaba yena ane kana dungal demba zo de ba de ba dungal demba ze de ngo kariji la jago re zaba yena ane korangi yu le dang nyumo ni le xie shabe ta chuji yinba yena ane 도denzigo dini chala dodenzigo res
Yes.
sabe girwa ta you le da nyumo ni le ke bege zaji yungo bozigo re chidan zaji zaba na ta dende ge lenyung ki de bege chu kan yi ban zaji be chabres ro zaji jaba ina da ta yung kachala din jargo ta kemido ya ta lenyung ki be chu de la ni yungo res sabe ge 진흙이 고바지단 지den지요래 말한 쪽에 난기 공부난게 다 왕봉알라서 베게 어다지 배샤자단 때문에서 베 대화도 동안 다 좋아돼도 마부지인 거 계속 간가 안에 라동알 덴바지 자고 그래서
Yes. The one thing that we are here to talk about is meaning of the Four Noble meaning or nature of the Four Noble Truth, beginning with the truth of suffering. Suffering, we would say, whatever entity that is the result of the karmic action and affliction, or whatever that arises from karmic action and affliction, is truth of suffering. And technical word that we would use would be contaminated. Whatever that is produced from karmic action and cause must be necessarily contaminated entity. And when we look at what was then produced, kind of two things. The first one is what we would call external, external sort of container or the external world. The second one would be what we call internal, the internal five aggregates, feelings, all the, the mentality. So would be categorized into these two, external and internal, and as a true suffering.
단도르도베나 마족의 실로네 론체기 아주 대ብ당 뉴구당 제나당 리더와 신동 강바다 디도 강가 암젤라 친어긴 지den지고레스 에네 마족의 주변나도 풍분디나도 뒤샤베게 최가래 임바네 tel라 난 주긴 지den지고레 강다 땡이볼라 동알 덴바제 자고레스 다 땡난게 예와 최고지 가르는 아주 치리 너긴지 텐드페나 단다 강반 디난도 여대베게 다 가바르자나미도 베자자나미도 조제자나 다 덴당 고갸당 대수 강가라 아레자나 디디지 니용거다 아레자나 아주 투몽이 론제야지다 가자 레레기 투모 마인베게 따지 론제야기 리수기베 텐데게 릭니요레스
So another way of saying is that, external, when we say external, whatever we kind of sees around us, books, pen, mountain, houses, whatever that we perceive, we call them external world. And then the second internal world would be whatever that is within this aggregate human body. So we can say, external world and internal world, two kind of category. And both of these two are true suffering or suffering of truth. Again, when we look at the external world, again, the things that we see around us, the table, cushions, everything, within the external walls, there are kind of, again, two category. Some things that can be sort of, we can enjoy or use collectively. And then there are some things that can be used specifically by, particular individuals.
선반자 대졸라다 동알 덴바즈 자기어르와 다 덴데게 동알 덴바텔라다 이와자나민도다 간데 자고 동알 덴바텔라 가리 오래잖아 다 동알 이동알 규리 동알 잡아도지기 동알 전에다 나가 숨이 미래와 숨지 치고래스 다 되는 게 담보 동알 이동알 잡아들이 다 동알 이동알 잡아대 자위게 동알 자대 동알 때 동알 임바 뇽 투겐 제거래스 그나 나랑절라 제 초 미래바지 중반에 때 미래와데 마히 바지 임바다 때 나라절 미래바지 임바데 맞아 미 임바이나 하고 두고래 어다 다가내신 소자 돈돌어서 봐 임바이나 감각이 투모도 가서 시두고래스
Yes.
덴데게 시두긴 기타 미다 돈도다 다 감각이지 투모도 동안데 소 미래와데 소 미래와 임바 하고도 그 용투경기 기 덴데게 ngo질라다 동알 이동할 자고래스
Yes. So those that was said earlier were all, considered as truth suffering or suffering of truth. And when we look at the true suffering, suffering we usually categorize into three, right? Suffering and suffering of change, and pervasive or conditioned suffering. The first one, suffering of suffering, when we say suffering of suffering, what it really means is suffering that we can sort of directly experience as a suffering. And therefore, we identify suffering as a suffering, something that is, something that is common to human as well as to animal. When they experience something, they don't want to experience it because knowing that it is a suffering. So those were all, comes under the first one, suffering of suffering.
데려와
No?
다 동알 텔라 동알 자고래스 다 유럽의 동알 자고 니바 데려와 다 유럽의 동알 자도라 간디질라 자고래 저바는 유럽의 동알 자도 다 다른 나라 쪽에 뇽대기 대화도 솔레시고래스 대 대화도 나라솔라 지 릴라나네자데 케쿠지 메베나 지때 대화 인제고래 대화 문진 지요래 다 다가내진 나주 다지 르기 야라질라 다지 설마도 부지두번에 때 설마데 마 텐샤디올라 지 갑두들지 레베 소와지 용고래 다 대도 맞을 대화 진교래스 다 덴데게 대화 대조다 대화 대외 등업의 대화래잖아 다 대화 말해스 대화 많이 받을 거래잖아 그 이질라다가 대화 인송이면 땡도 대화 대고 요래 대화 대두고 말이 운주도 그래서 그래서 덴데게 대화대 그지 가지 제라인 바이는다 야나 주도 कर्म 가지 제라이면 야면은 니마다 라베 가시기 전에 그 양 동알 경우는 주도 그래 대외가 안 대두고 말은 가서 지 소에 나왔다지 단다 대화에나 아마 가지 제라 가서 동알 용용도 그 대외인데 미투바 때레스 이마이다 그 규른 누구요 해서 대화대 대외원 만대 버치니 규른 누구요 해서 규르 동알 되고 그래서
Second, suffering of change. Suffering of change is basically happiness that we are experiencing right now. We call this kinds of coarse happiness. Happiness that we are experiencing right now is a suffering of change. And we identify healthy body, the absence of illness as a happy body, it's a happy state. when you pull out thorn from your body, pricking and in pain, picking out, and then absence of that is a state of happiness. In reality, those were not, happiness, because the basis on which you experience those things is not kind of, is not stable. It by nature it changes. So changes meaning, let's say that you consider as a happy state your physical condition. After seconds, after minutes, days, months, it doesn't remain same. It changes into some form of kind of suffering that you don't desire. And so therefore, suffering of change.
gyuri dungal zi tsirwa. Da kyaban duchi ki dungal zi gore. Kyaban duchi ki dungal zi dila andiji da jago gore sabana. Ta ngaran zoge me ngal dun ju bani, me ngal ne tse bani zi. Me ngal ne ma chilo la dun za bani zi de. Zaji nyele ni pungpo zi nji lu chi chata ki dui shaipo pungpo dini ji ma lengi gore. Lengi gore. Ti len shabati tagarang kyaban duchi ki dungal zi gore.
The third, commonly translated as a pervasive, the actual word would be pervasive compositional, pervasive composition, suffering of pervasive composition. And this suffering refers to the very, you can say, the aggregated body that we have, the one that was given birth by our mother. This body kind of, we use word contaminated, nyawar lemba.
Zaji nyawar lemba.
Nyawar lemba the ko khadlang.
Nyawar lemba zana ko yang na yang do ko dungal yingori ye dungal kigu.
Contaminated, repeatedly aggregate, it would be literal translation, meaning that, this contaminated body would again repeatedly suffer, over and over, sort of continuously. So this very aggregated body itself is the pervasive suffering.
Teza ngadu zamin di tendo thoma me ngale he yong du ni ko dong kyaban du ji dongal ye ran jin chen ji do he yong go res sajin azu gi yu ji sajin yawal be shada gi chi gi pongbo de dang nang gi sem ni ja lo dongal ye ran jin chen ji do he ye ben za tela chi da nang zi ni chi go res kyaban du ji gi azu gi kyaban du ji gi dongal de la chi 지게 자진여 지게 자지기 뭐 라바지다 난게 샘댕기다 소화돼서 건가와
Yes.
어 대조 건가 동아리 라이진전 동아리에코 라이진전지도 가르전다 그 동아리는 주야기 동아리 용경이 리수 기바서 가서 동아리 젤리전지도 동아리 용경이 있다 rawa meba dunga nyoya ki di kordo ki yores.
So this, human aggregate, right from the beginning, when given birth by one's mother, comes to existence with the nature of third suffering, pervasive suffering. And this nature of pervasive suffering within aggregate, we categorize into two, the physical aggregate and internal feelings. So there's a body and feeling two. And both of these two, when we say with nature, it means the very function of, this body without any choices and freedom must experience suffering or unsatisfactory things. So it has no choice but sort of conditioned to experience suffering.
Sonzan de la kyawa zadan duje zade ko signi duas signi bu de tanda kare zena tanda jongor mo chi chadab de nala 지 고대보지 레라고 시부지는 도마 대세 견도 때 가리즈 거래서 왜나 캬바제 돈라 네 단 도리도 선전 탐자랑 그냥 가라도 미치고 살다 봐이나 담불랭이 미리 담에다 가져 여봐이나 차장라 사진일이 풍부 지 강바다 라바당 지 원봉알서 봐요 집지간 그 차장라 타바이 말씀상 캬바제 인디지르스 거래스 두제 제도라 딘디게 샤다기 풍부대 롱알이 렌진제진바 또 롱알 뇽겐기 리수 주바진바 야마나 지 해와네 해와다 단단 딜라 롱알이 렌진진지 기바 맞제 치마대랑 양교로 거기 롱알 거기 전에 롱알 지 렌진진도 다이 히아인 비금전 그거라 거기 롱알 깨버지베잖아 거기 롱알 젠지 깨버지베 차네 두제 그거레스 그러나 롱알 기와 마주기 주부되게 기와 제만 다부테 양 롱알 젠지도 해야 돼 단단되게 주부되게 막 유제발을 때네 이 롱알 젠지 깨고에 김장될 때네 두제 그거레스 두제 해야 돼어 롱알 젠지 깨버 제긴기 다 유제고에 차네
The third suffering, so now the actual word, Tibetan, Kyapa Duje is a true word. Usually in English translation, you just find pervasive suffering, which that's translation of just half of the word, not, all. So Kyapa Duje, so Geshe was saying, it was explained in His Holiness book, the book that we have, in a very kind of simple way of understanding. First, pervasive means it pervades every beings, as a human, we can say it pervades across all humans, regardless of, nationalities, race, pervades every human being all across the earth. And second, compositional factor or composition refers to the nature of its conditioned suffering. So this, as long as the composite, you possess this composite, by nature, it is conditioned with suffering, bound to suffer. And not only that, this body, sort of makes you to suffer, experience suffering, but this is the body that's going to serve you as a cause of the future suffering as well.
임바선자 단다 디숨기는 다 동알 자와데 지 로디루 선전 담자로 공모트 투야 여되버지 아니 규르 동알다 갸반되지 동알 니보데 로아 밀라마도 마란조 지 야라 차상 산데게 마르시 동과 미리우스네 바 인데게 질라마네 린 로디루 옌데돌라 아니 덴데게 규르 동알다 갸반되지 동알니데 가자면서 가자 못하베나고 못해야 매데버지레스
So from these three types of suffering, the first suffering of suffering is something that everybody can experience or understand. The second suffering is suffering of change is something that can be understood only by human species and cannot be understood by other realms of the six realms. No.
도와 리두기는 단다 나란 쪽에 미기리 쪽에 대바데 다 투모마이미 캐주잖아 저놈이도 밀라 케비게 디 덴데기 동할 때서 규리 동할 때 갸반도지 동할 때서 못에는 못해야 여되긴 데라 지게 말랑이 단 주도기 림바 아니 제바이나 소속에 센딜라 제바이나 제투야 여되긴 이만상 아주 미기 투모마이비게 캐주데레스 미질라케데.
So we can say that as somebody who is born as a human being, we can say the benefit or the greatness from this perspective is that human to human, you can introduce what is suffering of suffering, and you can teach human how to adopt what is goodness and ways to kind of abandon or eliminate suffering, and that's the unique qualities of the human.
임바송자 다가르도다 딘데기 미기 리수지 키 단다 뒤전딜라 딘딜라 지자야게 고갑여되게 못해야게 디 소소라 남조 여대겐 냠수 랑바이나 데 다키와 제마텔라 지 동안 딜레 딘데기 동안 뇽 먹으베 지 탑시 제나 제야 단다 친딜라 맞주 미제들라 여대 대겐지 라에 마제바 임바이나 마제니 유샤바이나 말랑서 다지 돈루지기 개발렘바다 지바지양 차들
Yes. So, therefore, born as a human, and as said earlier, born as a human has the ability to understand suffering, has opportunity, to learn and study, and has human intelligence, and with kind of implementing your wisdom and understanding and experience, you can make yourself not to suffer the same suffering in the future. And there's a method, there's a ways, you have sort of access to everything. And if you don't do that, then there's really no difference between human and animal.
다 동알 덴바제 동알 덴베 ngodo tende da 이제로 다 군중 덴바제 되는 가르서 오잖아 랑이 디부르기 비 동알 덴바 계제기 다 레다 녀모지 임바이나 텔라 군중 덴바제 잡아레스 코랑기 디부르기 비다 도든지 계구여바이나 콜라 군중 덴바제 잡고레스
So that's briefly about suffering of truth or true suffering. Second, origin of suffering. The origin of suffering. Geshe is giving a technical kind of meaning. One that produce as a consequences karmic action and affliction and true suffering. One that produce easy way of saying is that one that produce or one that gives birth to true suffering is the true origin of suffering as its consequences.
달레 당 녀모제 니 군주 덴바텔라 레당 녀모제 니 용거레 레데라 같이 당게 레게 지 게벨레다 미게벨레다 다 기디 karmargi lezen karman deme lezen ingore taganajin che karingo gemege gevele migele tanyom gi leze gar taganajin ge yang che le ta lela namda yewa midaw mangbu ji ingore ro jedo ganga tananga joge 잘해야 재미도 양제마 대바 뒤져야나 가정을 대체야지 녀모제들라 녀모들라 자위기 녀모 대체들라 당기 공도 주반에 도자세단 티모 숨부터래 대숨기 나네 자와 강지고래잖아 마리 바투미 마리 바제디 지고래 더 저기 제단나 제단다 리 남자세 대소 강가 다지 지마텐다 엘라 주니 되게나 디여바이나 때카돌라다 오 살버진이 용기です.
Yes. And true origin of suffering, is composed of two things: karmic action and affliction, as we said earlier. And when we talk about karmic action, can be categorized into many different, sort of types. Talks about, virtuous, non-virtuous, mixed or both, neutral, and very extensive. We won't have enough time to go over into this, but we can do in the future if we need to. Secondly, on affliction, karmic affliction, the root of affliction, we said earlier, attachment, hatred, and ignorance. And again, the root of these three is not knowing. Sometimes use ignorance as well, but again, these are the very kind of foundational basic. Again, in the future, if you talk about 12 links of dependent origination, then under that comes the detail about karmic afflictions.
다 동알된바 군주된바 고베된바 고베된바 고 간디지 자고르잖아 자위게 lam kaya roa chigi ko ponje ta nyumo kaya roa chi me bar chebe ke chaji la ne goba ze ja chu res tanda di goba ze don tange renzi mari ba zawi ki nyumo kang imba yana keje ki zawa kang chi gore zana sui chi gore zana leda nyumo nyi ki nani nyumo te nange renzi mari ba za te ki chi gore ta renzi mari ba te dang chi ko nyempu chi renzi mari ba te la nyempu chi tu gengi lam chi nganya parche me lam chayin chi gore te parche me lam te ki ku ki renzi mari ba me par zebe ke cha chi la ta ngoba ze cha gore ane 상기 ki 당게 ngopa tharpa se jadola 상기 좀 된 되게 dimni pambe chaji pambe pamba zana mi dimni del zebe ze chaji o dendi jila ta ngopa se jagores
The nature of true cessation. True cessation is is a state of cessation of karmic action and affliction through whatever path that is needed for that cessation. So it's a state of cessation or state of absence, and when we talk about origin of suffering, we talk about karmic action and affliction. Within the affliction, three poison, and that all comes down to self-grasping ignorance. And self-grasping ignorance mind has its direct antidote, what we call path, uninterrupted path. And application of that uninterrupted path, one can come to the state where there is an absence of that, truth grasping ignorance, or a state where there's a cessation of such, truth grasping mind. And when we look at the enlightened beings, Buddhas, we talk about, cessation of the Buddha, meaning a state where there is a complete abandonment or elimination of two obscurations, or absence of two obscurations, and that state is called cessation, true cessation.
ta lamden ro lamji denba si don la ta dendi ki ngopa thobar che gengi tange renzi mari pada ngo zeda ngonga do sonde gengi eta thonlam parje melam tabuji yamena maranzola khondu shu chumboji la debe katola te mebar zoyala mazuge chamba tere yonemena ti khungwenye yonemena de chamba de chagores o de sebe ki chambe ki lote tela te gomba yina gomgi konzo khondu da shu chumbo kaze lamba na chamba gomal tini chambe ki khungwenye cheto khondu jiwar cheto gore tende ki lam jilata tandandi ki lam den zayate ki lam den jagores.
Yes. Fourth, true path, the nature of true path. True path is a path that makes you to attain to the state of cessation. That or in more technical term, it's uninterrupted path of seeing, uninterrupted path of seeing, that directly serve as an antidote to that truth grasping mind. But in ordinary understanding, when you are with the full of hatred or anger, and at that moment when you sort of cultivate or focus upon loving kindness mind serve as a direct antidote to such hateful anger, and therefore that loving kindness mind is a true path in that sense. It kind of calms down the hated anger. It serves as an antidote and replace that hatred anger.
되게 다 드링 렌지 모터 노르도 지차 손세 다 까마주마다 라마선 디와딜랜다 네 디와직 더지 지나로
So with that, we had a brief kind of introduction to Four Noble Truth, and we have about 10 minutes, and if you have any questions.
First, just like to say, if there's ever, we ever need 2 sessions to cover a topic.
Sure.
And my question was, the Buddhas are enlightened beings have completely eliminated mental afflictions and obscurations. Do they continue to create karma? Do they continue to create positive?
당부대시당 안주 계지 전례직 나로라 그 샤베기 롭센 마산 투주마 장에 되려도 그런 디모 처데스 하다가 저 저번이 저러 저번이 세 산에게 못 튀내게 레사네 또 되그러려 레사야 쇼려도
디바니젠데 디미젠데 텐도 제 트라바이나 양겨 사도 레사요 말레스 그봐 페나 마족에 징라 독자르도 지어라 독자르지 설마지 기고 여배나 곧 자원에 마고나 yar가다 로마도 가져면서 가져 제바이나 그 양세 이 연구도 와. 다 거기 자원에 매버들 자다는 양결 고신데가 도저 기야미도 가. 어떤 내신기 디미 코르 제 사서나 대왕기 다
대왕이 레사사면로
레사요.
레사 시당 레사라요 말로
아
레사
레제데 사요 말스.
레 지당 레 고르사요 말스
레제데 다데 디 군주된베 기기베데 레제레 모진 거래.
그래서 혼디
나가 저게 레당 녀모제 레데 다 군주된베 ngor기베 레당 녀모제레 세고라. 인제 그 레데 텐데게 레데 메서나 레데 요서나 되게 나민 디부진 도간데바데 용거라. 그 나민 디부 동알데 마녀아요 말스.
So the beginning with when we say karmic action here, the karmic action here we are talking about karmic action that is the part of the true origin of suffering. So in that context, two obscurations. If one has managed to completely eliminate it, two obscurations, there is no creation of new karmic action. The karmic action here, the part of the origin of suffering. And the example Geshe was using was if there's a poisonous weed in the farm, and if you pull out from the root, because of pulling out from the root completely, it won't be able to kind of grow again, and it's part. Otherwise, if there's a karmic action still remaining, then logically that karmic action needs to be producing the result, which in this sense kind of, we're talking about origin of suffering. So there's no such karmic action.
When they create virtues, there's that effect.
In a gewag lesa lesa yorol legimler.
오게벨레사 당게 나진데 게벨레 미겔레 루마 생이 레즈네 레라 남단치다 망보지 용거레스 남다 망보지 용거 여바이나 단다 레기 남자 샤데 군중 dembe기 되벨레 게 남자 라 예와치고레 게벨레 임바이나 테레 미겔레이나 테레 사비게 레기 다 가서 단도르나 사기게 레사게레 말해서 거다
기벨레 요래로
기벨레 요레스 데라 레기 나민 두부 동알 녀에지 요라 딘데게 레요 말했어.
So Geshe was reframing your question, saying that you're asking whether Buddha creates karmic action or not. So we talked earlier, the karmic action can be in the form of virtuous, non-virtuous, neutral. But in this context, we can say that yes, there's a creation of karma, but no creation of karma that results in suffering.
다다가르샤 갈망한 두로와 다 강타를 가서 드링기 조지나라 다 동알지 거만 보지 세네 Mazuka Troy Nala, Nalola, Kasi, Soa Media Chita Kalorza, Mahiba sort of Yungu Yuvaina, they don't all the Kardor Damazu Lungal Watch Chagu Mari. Mazu call La Carizana, or more de Dela, Delin Daldoji, Chigu Yavana, Delang Ninjus is what is the goddess. Navasaji Juni, the Chugi Nani, call and Chi Chul and Juyala, Tomang Ninjus at the Meba Makivaina, Mazu Makivaina, Navasaji Chula, Juk to woman and Juya Gita, Chagores. In by that, Chu Kandiji Tembayana, Sanji so much $10. Tambu Ninju Motor, Standard Digi, Dungal Demba, the Gunju Demba, Tambu Sunga Gimsa, the Koakaris and a Kogi. Koigi Dungal that they took on Noma Tabana, they never doing Ninjung Loti, get to go married. Chesa, think motivators. Tebe Chagores.
So today with the topic we talked a lot about suffering, and so by talking about suffering, and if you experience a sense of, Geshe was saying, sense of unhappiness and not not happy feeling, that feeling is suffering or not, saying wouldn't consider that as a suffering in itself. And in Buddhism, we talk about renunciation. So with the knowledge of the suffering, when you want to free from such suffering, that thought or that state of mind is renunciation. And renunciation is something that is required as a sort of foundation and root in order to engage in dharmic practice. So that's something that is needed. And so when we introduce, in the Four Noble Truths, true suffering, origin of suffering, without understanding suffering, there won't be renunciation. So for the sake of renunciation, or in order to have cultivate renunciation, the perspective here is that we can, have this knowledge of suffering and origin of suffering as well.
So that Dungal the Kandijilla in the Ringita, Dungal the Kandijire, Dungal Tigi Hijiki Yukarisha, Titu, Mar Mateva Jimba, and I think Dungal then those young do. You didn't deliver than a young do something. Mar Mateva Jing, 3 Sardo Thursday. Mar Thursday Jimbana, tell a Yanker Karsogi, Kazuja Sudoku, Dungal the raving or Dusuma, Chikawaji, Gawaji Gomani, the Kogaving or Dusayurs. Or then the Uruvaina, the ring in Nimate, Tola Mendo, choose a member chat, Mamta Salat, the Digichagoris. They never the Gawaji or YouTubers.
So, talking about suffering, origin of suffering, and all about suffering, if you have already heard, if you haven't heard this before, then, you can have a thought of, I have attained new knowledge, about suffering. And if you already knew, then it would be kind of remembrance of what you already know. And then with that kind of remembrance and attaining of knowledge, and knowing that suffering can be eliminated, and you can transform that thought into joyful thought, that I can do such thing with the suffering. And therefore, with that thought, sitting here and spending time here won't be sort of wasted.
Thank you.
건수도 검사행을 또 건수도 동행골 시행이 검사행을. I was informing Geshe that you all must have been already spoiled by listening too much about suffering many times.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So if a friend or someone, I met somebody and they're telling me their dog died and they're crying, and then I cry, is that suffering? Am I suffering? Is it something I should observe and practice? Like, what do I do with that?
가져오랬어.
가르사.
정보지 키지 시스는 키지는 고대는 냠도 고고래. 너무 교대 동해를도. 이내는 내가 가르쳐 그래서.
이, 다 소설라지, 다 시부지, 다 소속이 다 재와 여되긴 게, 다 소자 간디다지 임바이나, 그, 시기 여반에, 마란전에 집어지긴 레러. 집어지긴 레디, 시위즈, 시니시다레, 코, 로니언이 요마라 가져면서 가져 무바이나, 영화에, 로에는 요마르러. 다, 마란전 무에디, 그, 붕알지기 왕기 무구여래 아주 하구여래 때 문에 폐야 때 가려요 기대 양교 로네 여여래 선전데 양교 수야 여와 여바이나 아주 문에 뱅거래 같이 때 뱅기 매바이나 그 문에 펜도게 민도 와서 라
무로시나 그것이.
아
뒤에는
어다
무로시.
젠지 다가내진 말한수 로바지 된디 또 무구여나 때 냠도 무로 제바이나 그 펜도 지부대 건요 펜도지용 양교 수야기 되지 여바이나 문에 디고 무로 가서면서 왔다 게 여자 잡는 문에 디고 가서 끼인가가 버도 왔다 미기 치마 세세 버도 문에 디고 그래 대요 말해 봐서 라 제가 야세 주얼에게 단단히 갈대 주소였네 그 텔레미가 지지였어 갈대 주소면은 텔레미가 자지 벤스 왔다 디니게 문에 그 디부 지게 제아지 여바이나 팬도에 지여반 디부 고초 로니요 여바나 가서 문에 디고 문에 팬도고 때 매바이나 딘디지 매바이나 가서 무어디 톨라레스 대승고레스
Whatever living beings that we care, that we love, they are just the same as ourselves, that they are going to die at some point. That's a reality. And once they died, if by crying and if through any methods, if you're able to bring back life, then it's a worth of crying. But then you have to ask yourself, why are you crying? And what's the purpose of crying? And when we cry, obviously, crying because of some sense of, we can say suffering. But the point here is that we need to ask what's the benefit or what's the point of crying. And it doesn't matter if you're saying whether you help somebody to cry with, cry along, whether you cry loudest using all your tears. But ultimately, what is the benefit of, sort of doing such act of going through such experience? So, these commonly quoted Shanti Deva's words. What is the, kill the Jews?
단다 디진 단다 딘디기 소자데 시사교데 양교 선여 여바이나 문화 아주 문화 그 성기래 망문화 성기로 제가 무에데 팬도요 말레스 시사교데 선여 매바이나 가정 문화 제야요 말레스 가정 문화고 팬도요 말레스
So if, including pet dog, if somehow that dog is going to come back to life, then why cry? If it is impossible to, coming back to life, then what's the point of crying? So she was quoting Shanti Deva's, famous, what is the point of frustration if there's a remedy? And, if there's a remedy, why not happy about it? If there's no remedy, what's the point of frustration?
다원아 가르치고 딘디기 시교 선전들라 마주게 팬도야 가르요래 팬도가 매래 대양 말에 마주 제야요래 마주 콜라 팬버지 제야나 제야요래 다 뭐야 될래 너데 거기 던달라 다 몰람 자야래 어다 control 쳐봐 볼래래 야 선전 내송라 짐바다야라 소비 콜라미니 되제바요 이게 그 시사교데 로데야라 팽기오 말에데 그 남시 되게 가리자베나 기와 제마들라 지 류장부지당 류야부지 렌토야라 and then roche to what.
Yes. So in a sense, you know, it doesn't matter how much you cry, it's kind of a sort of wasteful energy. But but there is you know, something to do, you know, to benefit, you know, that pet or that being that passed away, such as you know, making prayers, offering, practice of generosity, for the sake of that, you know, past living being pet, you know, future better rebirth. That would be kind of, you know, beneficial.
But could it also be an expression of empathy
Mm-hmm.
for the owner of that pet
Mhm.
who's very sad about it?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
if you're crying out of compassion, and empathy for the owner's loss,
Mm-hmm.
can it be seen in that fashion too?
Mm-hmm. 그래서 좀 오해된다. 미 키가 다고 저러. 그래서 오해 키가 다고 들라. 뭐 되게 잠닝지기 천고 말해서 다른 도스타는 뒤 말하러. 또 제는 우주도 배주 여러 알로 왔다 간다. That's a good point. Yeah, I was saying, so to your point was that crying is useful, right? In that context, you're helping.
Well,
Pena-
useful for the owner
Yeah, all of that pet, yeah.
is very sad.
That in the
And your tears
Uh-huh.
are really an acknowledgement
Mhm.
of loss
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing momentary.
네, 내 배지장시고 배지적으로
Mm-hmm.
배나 나랑 저기 조부지기 노르 잘라지 더지려라. 메셔고 여바나. 메셔고 여바나 때랑 아주 그냥 디 눔루바이나. 펭구어레 뉴구어레스 파졸라. 아주 잘라들 펭구어레 뉴구어레. 어때나지레스. 아주 대 동아리 용 나르네 무구 여바텔랑 아주 무러 제바이나. 가족이 동아리 델리 삽체로 된 거래. 마도 대 가족 동아리 충으로 된 거 말이야. 충으로 된 거는 아주 펭구어레. 그러니까 가족 동아리 충으로 둬도 그러나 대 가족이 펭구어레 마도 매 말겨가는 놈루바나 매 체로 누구를 마도 매 충으로 누구 말아. 어때나지레스.
Because they were saying, he used an example of, you know, if your friend's property is on fire, and by pouring more fuel on the fire, are you helping him or not? So when you are crying along with the owner, in your case, you are helping in the sense that you are making that owner more sad by crying more. So is that an addition or is that helping? You are adding more kind of sadness in crying and therefore making kind of, I don't know, more suffering.
콜라 펜바지 거 맞잖아. 다 거기 동아리 충으로 가졌다. 아주 간데서 당문도 그 동안 매바 간데서 저거 들어와.
Yes.
동아리 텔레 잘했답까. 락 제약하는도 대 제바이나 이게 콜라 펜거.
So the really beneficial thing here is that how can you, if you can eliminate the suffering, if not reduce, diminish the suffering, that's the reason why you know, that's the beneficial, that's what you are supposed to be doing, right? Not adding more. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one more thing to that.
Uh-huh.
So from a Buddhist perspective, we know that this, being is, the sentient being is going to go on. But we say to our friend who's not a Buddhist, well, yeah, but they'll be reborn again. That might create more suffering also. So understanding where that person is, and what working with them means seems like would be more beneficial rather than might be what we say we believe.
나도 고문하래 계실라 시에데 낭주 따당원 시고로서 다 보죠 시에서 낭주 그냥 마찬가지 정해진 단대 교화치 말은 단대 롱을 랑에다 바로 동해 망으로 내매로 저다디 시에서라 유들 따고 말을 해서 지워대
티 아주 나중에 지금 나중에 자주 지금 말했어. 그봐. 개와 제마다 제메까지 제바이나 그 나중에 가자지 레용 거래 다 강사 추기까지 지지 레용 거래스
Mm.
파조 미들라 동알 여바이나 때란 동알 징무부 여바이나 때란 냥도 물어 제바되기 추기까지 개 말이스
Mm.
저 추기까지 말이 추기 밀랭지 그렇게 밀랭지만아 파조 무겐데라 가서 물어 제바는데 파조대 동알 슈르 슈 체른 누구 여바데 그 지당이 뒤 중이랬어 저 개레멜랭 가자게요 말이 저 개멜랭이나 동알 여래 에 동알 여르잖아 동알 되고요 말이 동알 될리 달 고요 말
Mm-hmm.
제마다 대 저기 제가 지지 자고 말했어
So Geshe was saying that what we are talking here has nothing to do with religion. If you talk about rebirth, future rebirth, then it's about it. But here we are simply kind of very much focused on crying, the crying, helping with helping kind of more crying along with that person who is crying. So it's just we are talking about state of sadness and crying and how can we relieve such kind of suffering. And we are not talking about rebirth, So he was saying it's kind of common sense, the general knowledge. When somebody is crying, if you sit and crying together, it brings more sadness, more crying, and so he was saying, it's not talking about kind of, rebirth system, but rather just how can we help within that state of crying and sadness.
다 당에 가족이 니지 여러다 아주 선전대 동바인 가족이 지야 답시 지여래 되라 지 몰람 제야다 개와 제야다 지까지 시고래 된데 가자디 세바이나 고 저기 가자디 아니 지 지질래 용거래
Yes.
가지 파조버데 저그 밀랭기 가자지 마이나 되라 바베 파조벌라 페야 지야 여래스 그 인지미지 최제베 가자 말에 저제 파조버데 대체지 주구입에 가자게 말해서 파조베데 동알 지역에 탑라면 인지미지 최고 돈이 제거게 말해 마저게 삼력의 돈이 삼력의 롭석의 돈이 그 지역에 탑람되는 방법 여러 왔어 대체게 레멜랭 단대와게 말해서 그 삼력 롭석 마저 삼력 그 삼력을 유지다니 거기 동알디 레 열답 간데 지야라 추기 bejo tango keyo mare chudan del go keyo mare
But if we talk about earlier, like prayers, then we are talking about religion, belief system that might not appropriate to that person or owner. But again, after passing away, the method of helping that person doesn't necessarily has to be religion. Could be simply kind of here. What we really need is that person's thought of sadness to change, to relieve that thought. So you're working with that really particular thought, and you can change, help with that belief, through a very, we can say, kind of non-religious way. Could be many different ways of helping in such kind of situation. Geshe is not going to give up more questions.
Thank you. Ale. Marira koe singa su pendan dewa malen juve ne tere dewa tenzin ya shabe sede bardo tengyuro ji jabo ba che sara chimba na kundo sambo te ya tada kunje je su dalo sin gewa te da kamje ra tu tuzon jabe jawa tamse je mwa kan la chodo ma ba In
the land encircled by snow-white mountains, the source of all happiness and serenity flows in your person, generosity, Tenzin Gyatso, remain until samsara ends. Just as the Bodhisattva Geshe denominations and some undeveloped too. So now to dedicate these ignorance to train and follow in their footsteps. As all the victorious Buddhas of the past, present, and future praise dedication as supreme, so now I do dedicate these sources of my merit for all beings to provide good actions.
Thank you.